The train was the first thing they found. Not the camp, the train. 39 sealed freight cars sitting on the rail tracks just outside the Dachau perimeter, baking in the April sun. The smell hit the soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division before they got anywhere near the cars. Men who had been in continuous combat since Sicily in 1943, men who knew what death smelled like in its various forms, stopped walking. Some of them said later they knew what was in the cars before they opened them. They opened them anyway. Inside were approximately 2,000 corpses, some skeletal, some in advanced decomposition, brain matter visible on the ground near one car where a prisoner had been beaten hard enough to collapse the skull. The 45th had come ashore in Sicily in July 1943. They had fought through Italy, through southern France after the 1944 landings, across the Rhine and into Bavaria. 500 days of combat, give or take. They had seen the dead of the battlefield. Nothing in 500 days had produced what they were looking at now. They hadn't even entered the camp yet. April 29, 1945. The war in Europe had less than 2 weeks left. Adolf Hitler had 11 days to live. Units from the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Infantry Division had been redirected from the drive on Munich to secure a concentration camp called Dachau, roughly 10 miles outside the city. Major General Wade Haislip's 15th Corps had been told a camp was near Munich. The exact location wasn't entirely clear. Neither was what would be found there. The 45th Infantry Division had been in continuous combat since the Sicily landings in July 1943. They had fought up the Italian boot through Salerno and Anzio and the grinding stalemate of the Italian winter campaign. They had landed in southern France in August 1944 as part of Operation Dragoon and pushed north through the Rhone Valley. They had crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and entered Germany. By April 29th, they had been in more or less constant combat for roughly 600 days, with the brief pauses of reorganization and resupply that any sustained military campaign requires, but nothing that would count as rest. Their patch showed a yellow Thunderbird on red and gold. They called themselves the Thunderbirds. Their casualty list across the entire campaign ran into the thousands, and the men still standing on April 29th were, in the specific sense that the word applies to soldiers, survivors. The 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, had its own parallel history of sustained combat and its own exhausted men. Together, they were moving toward a camp whose name most of them had never heard and whose nature none of them would have been able to accurately describe even if they had tried. Nobody told the men going in what kind of camp it was, because nobody giving the order fully knew. The American military in April 1945 was aware that the Nazis had built camps across occupied Europe. The nature and the scale of what was inside those camps was something that had been reported on, estimated, half understood, and incompletely believed for years. When the Army first liberated Buchenwald and Ohrdruf earlier in April, the reports that came back from those camps had produced a response that suggested even the generals were processing information they had not fully prepared for. Eisenhower himself had visited Ohrdruf and had made a specific point of ordering his troops and local German civilians to walk through the camps and see what was there, reportedly saying that he wanted there to be no room for denial later. But knowledge of a thing in general terms and knowledge of what it looks like in specific physical terms are two entirely different things. Lieutenant William Walsh, 23 years old and a combat veteran by any reasonable measure, had settled on a mental model based on an American POW facility he had once seen in upstate New York. Organized, administrative, prisoners in some kind of structured confinement. He was still using that model when his company approached the Dachau perimeter. The camp had been running for 12 years. Dachau opened in March 1933, 5 weeks after Hitler became chancellor. The first concentration camp the Nazis built and the institutional model for every one that followed. It was originally designed to hold political opponents of the new regime, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, journalists, anyone who might organize resistance. Over the following years, the prisoner population expanded to include Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, homosexuals, Polish clergy, Soviet prisoners of war. The categories kept widening as the Reich's definition of who needed to be removed kept expanding. The SS used Dachau as its institutional training ground for concentration camp personnel throughout the entire life of the camp system. The procedures developed and practiced there were the procedures that spread to Bergen-Belsen, to Mauthausen, to Flossenburg, to Neuengamme, to Stutthof, to dozens of other camps across occupied Europe. The men who learned their trade at Dachau went on to run facilities across the continent. They took with them the administrative methods, the punishment systems, the daily operational logic of running a place designed to degrade and ultimately destroy the people inside it. In this sense, Dachau was not just a camp. It was the origin point of the entire system. More than 200,000 people passed through it between 1933 and 1945. At least 40,000 died there, a number that doesn't include the thousands transferred to extermination centers when they became too weak to be useful. Medical experiments were conducted throughout the camp's history. Prisoners were submerged in ice water until they died, the researchers timing how long it took and at what temperature point the body gave out. They were infected with malaria and tuberculosis. They were placed in low-pressure chambers designed to simulate high-altitude aircraft conditions that caused the blood to boil. They were infected with blood poisoning and treated with experimental compounds that didn't work. They were forced to drink only seawater to test how long a person could survive on it. The researchers filed their findings in German medical journals. This continued for 12 years, every day at a facility 10 miles outside Munich, a city of more than 800,000 people. Inside the camp, more than 30,000 prisoners were still alive, most of them barely. The final weeks had destroyed even Dachau's own internal order. As Allied forces closed in, the SS had been transferring prisoners from camps closer to the front lines into Dachau, creating a population density that the already overwhelmed facility could not sustain. Typhus was spreading through the barracks. Food had essentially stopped arriving. The Red Cross had tried to negotiate access in the days before the liberation and had been stonewalled. The dead were everywhere, stacked in the crematorium, lying in the streets between barracks, piled in corners and doorways where there had been no capacity to move them. The 45th Division had entered Dachau expecting something like a prison. They found something that had no name yet in April 1945, because the specific language for what they were looking at was still being developed by people who had not yet finished looking at it. Lieutenant William Cowling wrote to his family that evening. He had seen a lot. This was different. He described prisoners who were barely more than skeletons, men who wept when the Americans appeared without being able to say anything, people who had been reduced by years of systematic deprivation to states that he did not have adequate words for. Private Harold Porter wrote to his parents that Gandhi, after a 30-day fast, would still look like Hercules next to some of the men he saw that day. Porter added that he found himself trying to deny what his own eyes were telling him. It is easy to read about atrocities, he wrote. They must be seen before they can be believed. And even then. In the days before the Americans arrived, the SS had been destroying evidence and moving prisoners. On April 26th, approximately 7,000 prisoners, most of them Jews, were forced onto a death march south toward Tegernsee. People who could not keep up were shot on the road. The march continued for days, moving through Bavarian towns whose residents watched from the pavement. American forces would eventually intercept the column and liberate the survivors in early May. The ones who made it. The SS commandant Martin Weiss had been the commandant of Dachau for much of the war and was associated with the camp's administration through its worst years. But in those final chaotic days, the senior staff had largely dispersed. The man who remained to formally surrender the camp was a young SS lieutenant named Heinrich Whitaker, who had been at Dachau only briefly and who did not bear primary responsibility for what the Americans found there. Whitaker surrendered formally at the main gate. He was shot by liberated prisoners before the afternoon was over. The men most responsible for Dachau, the ones who had run its experiments and maintained its operations through 12 years, were not present on April 29th. What came next is the part that was classified for 46 years. Walsh was inside the compound, on the other side of the perimeter, when he encountered 4 SS soldiers in a freight boxcar. They had formally surrendered. They were unarmed and offering no resistance. Walsh shot all 4 of them with his pistol. Private Albert Pruitt, also 23 years old, climbed into the boxcar behind him and shot the wounded men a second time to make sure. In a coal storage yard near the edge of the main compound, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks of the 157th Infantry Regiment had approximately 50 German prisoners confined in an L-shaped area enclosed by an 8-foot masonry wall, adjacent to a hospital building. The prisoners had surrendered and been disarmed. Sparks left a machine gun team from Company 1 to watch them and headed toward the center of the camp to deal with SS guards who still hadn't given up their weapons. He had walked a short distance when he heard the machine gun fire. He knew immediately. He turned and ran back. A 19-year-old soldier was behind the gun. He had already killed around 12 of the prisoners and wounded several more. The bodies were against the wall. The remaining prisoners were still inside the enclosed area. When Sparks reached the soldier, he was sobbing, almost incoherent. He told Sparks the prisoners had tried to escape. Sparks kicked him away from the gun. It was the single act that limited the coal yard incident to 12 dead instead of 50. Sparks was a combat veteran who had been in the war since North Africa. He understood what had happened. He also understood why. Across the camp, variations of the same thing were happening in ways that would never be fully reconstructed. American soldiers were shooting surrendered SS guards at several locations. Some guards were shot by liberated prisoners who had been given weapons by American soldiers, or who had taken weapons from the guards themselves. Some guards were beaten. Soldiers of the 157th Infantry watched 2 prisoners beat an SS guard to death with a shovel and made no move to stop it. Heinrich Whitaker, the SS lieutenant who had formally surrendered the camp at the main gate a few hours earlier, was shot by prisoners before the day was over. How many SS guards died during the reprisals is one of those historical questions that will probably never have a definitive answer, because the chaos of April 29th made precise record-keeping impossible, and because some of the people who knew were not inclined to say. The official Army count from the subsequent investigation put the number at 17. Felix Sparks, who was there and who spent decades thinking about this, consistently said 30 to 50. Howard Buechner, the division's medical officer, published a book in 1986 claiming the number was close to 500, describing a systematic, organized massacre of surrendered soldiers that would constitute one of the largest single war crimes committed by American forces in the European theater. Almost no military historian accepts Buechner's figure, and for a specific reason. In May 1945, less than 2 weeks after the events, Buechner gave a sworn statement to Army investigators in which he said he had seen 15 or 16 dead Germans. The man claiming 500 in 1986 had sworn to 15 or 16 in 1945. 30 to 50 is the number the evidence supports. On May 2nd, 3 days after the liberation, Major General Arthur White, the 7th Army's Chief of Staff, ordered a formal investigation into the killings. The assignment went to Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, a 41-year-old Army lawyer who served as the 7th Army's Assistant Inspector General. Whitaker arrived at Dachau the following day with a forensic brief. Determine what happened, who was responsible, and whether prosecution was warranted. He examined the coal yard. He measured the area and documented the physical evidence. He found 15 spent .45 caliber shell casings on the ground near the wall. He took sworn statements from nearly 24 soldiers, ranging from general to private, everyone who had been present or who had relevant knowledge. The statements were, as sworn statements taken in the immediate aftermath of extreme events tend to be, imprecise and sometimes contradictory. Men remembered things differently. The timeline was blurry. Some of the imprecision was probably genuine. Some of it was probably not. Whitaker completed his report on June 8, 1945. It documented what had happened with enough specificity that Walsh, Pruitt, the machine gunner in the coal yard, and potentially several others could have been named in formal charges. Then George Patton got involved. Patton had visited other liberated camps. He had seen what was in them. When the 45th Division came under his command in the post-war period, he made his position on the Dachau investigation clear and unambiguous. Patton was not a man who expressed himself in ambiguous terms. He summoned sparks. According to accounts from the period, he took hold of the Whitaker investigation report and disposed of it in a manner that ended the conversation, and told the men of the 45th that they had fought well, and that was the end of it. Patton's view of the matter, expressed in various forms to various people, was that the SS guards at Dachau had gotten what they deserved, and that prosecuting American soldiers for delivering it would be an obscenity. This was not an unusual view among American commanders who had seen the camps. Hayslip, in his formal written response to the Whitaker findings, had already laid out the argument. Prosecuting the soldiers would be ill-advised, he wrote, because it would ignore the unbalancing effects of the horrors and shock of Dachau on combat troops already fatigued from more than 30 days of continuous action. He specifically named the train, with its cars of dead bodies, as the kind of sight that would naturally produce a strong mental reaction in officers and men. What Hayslip was articulating, without using the legal term, was something close to temporary insanity. The principle under military law that a soldier cannot be held responsible for his actions if a mental condition has impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. His argument was that what these men saw on April 29th qualified. Patton had made his position clear through direct action. Hayslip made his through formal memoranda. The Army accepted both. The case was closed without charges of any kind. Not a single soldier faced court-martial for anything that happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945. The Whitaker Report was classified. It stayed that way until 1991, when a copy surfaced in the National Archives in Washington and was made available to researchers for the first time. Walsh never apologized. In 1990, 45 years after the events, he gave an interview about what happened at Dachau, in which he said that every SS man shot there that day knew exactly why he was being shot and had no grounds for complaint. He was not describing this as a difficult question. When the interviewer pressed him on whether what he had done constituted a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, and it did technically, the shooting of unarmed, surrendered soldiers is a war crime regardless of what those soldiers had themselves done, Walsh said, "When I get to hell, I'll check it out and find out if I was wrong." He delivered this with the composure of a man who had been living with the question for 45 years and had arrived at a position he found stable. He died in 2001 at 79. He never changed his answer. Sparks went the other direction. He spent decades being precise about what had happened and what hadn't, correcting exaggerated accounts, keeping the record as accurate as he could make it. He was not seeking absolution, he was insisting on the facts. Sparks died in 2007 at 90 years old. Walsh died in 2001. This is where the story stops being about April 29th and starts being about something larger. Hayslip put his reasoning on the record in his formal response. The unbalancing effects of the horrors of Dachau on combat troops already pushed past the limits of normal endurance. The train with its 2,000 dead, the 30,000 survivors, the physical evidence of 12 years of systematic murder in every building and every face. These were not men looking for an excuse. They were men who had been in combat for 600 days and who then saw Dachau in a single morning and came apart, briefly, in specific ways that violated the laws of war. That the Army chose not to prosecute them is, under those specific circumstances, defensible. And most people who think carefully about what those men actually saw and experienced end up acknowledging as much, even if they're uncomfortable saying it. But if one morning was enough to do that to the men who liberated it, What does that say about the men who ran it? Not the soldiers who arrived in shock and lost their bearings for an afternoon. The men who came to work at Dachau every day for 12 years. The doctors who designed and conducted the experiments and went home to dinner. The guards who logged the incoming transports and maintained the crematorium and kept the records that the army later found and used at Nuremberg. The administrators who managed the daily operations of a facility designed to kill people through labor, starvation, disease, and deliberate murder, and who apparently experienced no unbalancing effect whatsoever while doing so. Those men, by their own accounts and by the testimony of the Nuremberg proceedings, had no difficulty maintaining their moral clarity throughout. They knew what they were doing. They kept excellent records about it. They continued to do it for 12 years, every day, at a facility 10 miles outside a major German city whose residents later claimed not to have known what was happening there. The American soldiers lost their bearings for one afternoon. The men who ran the place never lost theirs at all. The Dachau Memorial stands on the site of the original camp outside Munich. The rail tracks are still there. The foundations of the barracks remain. The crematorium is intact and open to visitors. When you walk through it, you pass the ovens, and the documentation room with its photographs and records, and the memorial plaques in multiple languages that try to put into words something that resists being put into words. The first prisoners arrived in March 1933. The last ones walked out in April 1945. You can decide what to do with that. Subscribe if you want to keep getting history like this. And if this one stayed with you, leave a like. It helps the channel reach more people who should know this story.